In April 1947, the former commandant of Auschwitz would stand on a gallows built within sight of his own chimneys. But in 1900, in the spa town of Baden-Baden, Rudolf Höss was merely a silent boy destined for the Catholic priesthood. His father, Franz Xaver Höss, ruled the household with the same rigidity he learned as a colonial merchant in East Africa. The boy was an only son. Discipline was absolute. Obedience was the only currency. Rudolf grew introverted, a vessel waiting for a master. 1914 changed everything. His father died. The Great War began. How does a devout altar boy become an architect of industrial genocide? The answer lies in the total militarization of a collapsing empire. At 15, Höss falsified his papers. He traded the cassock for a field tunic. Initially, he served as an infirmary assistant. Soon, the teenage soldier was shipped to the Eastern Front, Turkey, Palestine, Iraq. The sensory reality of the front was brutal. The sharp scent of rifle grease mixed with the cloying stench of hospital carbolic. Höss saw the Armenian genocide. He watched the Turks orchestrate systematic slaughter. To a 17-year-old, mass violence became a logistical norm. He excelled in the chaos. At 17, he became one of the youngest non-commissioned officers in the German army. The dust of the Middle East coated his uniform during the ceremonies. He received the Iron Cross, both first and second class. He wore them with a cold, unwavering pride. Then came the collapse of 1918. The German Imperial Army once numbered millions of men. Their sudden demobilization shattered the national economy. The humiliating conditions of the Treaty of Versailles left the young veteran with nothing but resentment. Thousands of armed men returned to a country that no longer existed. Germany had lost 1/7 of its territory and all of its colonial pride. The humiliation of 1918 forced thousands of armed veterans onto the streets of Germany. The empire had collapsed. The professional soldiers had no place in the new republic. These men formed the Freikorps. It was a shadow army of the Weimar Republic. At its peak, the movement mobilized over 500,000 combatants. Rudolf Höss sought a new war. He found it in the streets. He fought communist insurgents in the Ruhr and Upper Silesia. Political violence became his daily routine. In 1922, he arrived in Munich. He heard Adolf Hitler speak. The rhetoric of revenge resonated. Höss joined the National Socialist Party immediately. His membership card was number 3240. He was an early believer. The radicalization required blood. In 1923, a German saboteur was executed by French authorities. The nationalists blamed a local teacher, Walther Cadeau. They labeled him a traitor. Höss did not hesitate. He joined a death squad that included Martin Bormann, the future secretary to the Führer. They drove Cadeau to a forest near Parchim. The execution was primitive. They beat the teacher to death with clubs and finished him with a gunshot. The law still functioned, briefly. The court sentenced Höss to 10 years in prison. He spent his time in a cell refining his ideology. He studied racial theory. He spoke only to other radicals. He served 5 years. In 1928, he walked out of the prison gates due to a general political amnesty. Freedom arrived through a loophole. The political amnesty of 1928 cleared the prison cells. Radicals returned to the streets. Höss sought order in the soil. He joined the Ardeman League. This Volkisch movement rejected the city and preached racial purity through agrarian labor. On these farms, the future took shape. He met Hedwig Hensel. She became his wife and the mother of his 5 children. But a more significant shadow fell over the fields. Heinrich Himmler, a rising leader in the movement, watched the disciplined ex-convict. The Great Depression of 1929 broke the Weimar Republic. Millions lost everything. For the National Socialists, the chaos was a ladder. By 1933, Adolf Hitler held the chancellery. The state and the party became one. Höss saw his opening. In 1934, he accepted Himmler's personal invitation. He traded the farmer's tunic for the black wool of the SS. Silver runes flashed on his collar. The transition from a peripheral insurgent to a state official was complete. He was no longer just Rudolf Höss. He was a component in a burgeoning machine of exclusion. His identity was codified in the Central Registry, SS member number 193,616. In 1934, the man with SS number 193,616 entered a system that had effectively replaced the judicial power of the Reich. The chaos of street brawls and Freikorps assassinations was over. In its place stood a sterile, documented bureaucracy of pain. How does one institutionalize terror across an entire nation? Theodor Eicke provided the blueprint. In March 1933, on the outskirts of Munich, he established Dachau. It was not merely a prison, it was a laboratory. Eicke built the system on three pillars: absolute terror, ideological indoctrination, and administrative precision. The shift was surgical. Street violence was messy. Dachau was mechanical. Eicke drafted the Discipline and Punishment Code. It was a manual for methodical cruelty. Rudolf Höss became its most diligent student. He started as a Blockführer, the immediate overseer of a prisoner barrack. Here, he mastered the art of collective punishment. He learned to weaponize distrust, shattering any chance of prisoner solidarity before it could form. The daily routine revolved around the roll call. A sharp, rhythmic blast of a whistle signaled the start. Thousands of prisoners snapped into frozen rows. They stood for hours in the mud, regardless of the heat or the freezing rain. Höss watched from the perimeter. He recorded every discrepancy in his ledger. His efficiency earned him a promotion to Reportführer. He now supervised other Blockführer and managed the logistics of the daily encounters. The brutality was never arbitrary. It was a rationalized system of control. Höss observed how Eicke transformed young guards into impassive executioners. He saw the formula: combine military camaraderie with a slow, deliberate desensitization to human suffering. By the end of his tenure at Dachau, the process of professional numbing was complete. The successful tenure at Dachau opened the gates to the administrative heart of the SS. In 1938, the system transferred its rising star to Sachsenhausen. The camp sat just 25 miles from Berlin. It served as the model for the entire Reich. Sachsenhausen was a triumph of engineering over humanity. Berlin architects designed the perimeter as an equilateral triangle. One machine gun tower sat at the apex. From this single point, every barrack and every inch of the roll call square remained under constant visual control. Geometry became a tool of suppression. Höss served as adjutant to Commandant Hermann Baranowski. He did not just manage prisoners, he managed space and time. He synchronized executions, forced labor, and barracks logistics with a watchmaker's precision. The winter of 1939 tested the camp's capacity. Temperatures plummeted below zero. The barracks were overflowing. To maintain the architecture of order, Höss enforced a radical measure of spatial control. He ordered prisoners not assigned to labor squads to remain outdoors for hours. They stood in the wind without winter clothing. Dozens froze to death in the snow. When the desperate sought refuge in the infirmary, Höss ordered the doors locked. He viewed the corpses not as a failure of humanity, but as a necessary byproduct of discipline. Heinrich Himmler monitored these results closely. He saw a subordinate who prioritized the system over the resource. In May 1940, the Reichsführer SS signed the order for a new assignment in occupied Poland. Himmler promoted Höss to Commandant of Auschwitz. In May 1940, the SS required an administrator to secure the newly occupied Polish territories. The choice fell on the expert from Sachsenhausen. Rudolf Höss arrived at a former Polish military barracks near the town of Auschwitz. The Germans renamed the site Auschwitz. The location was a logistical masterpiece. A finger traced the map of Europe. One line from Berlin, one from Warsaw, one from Vienna. All converged here. The Auschwitz railway junction connected the industrial wealth of Silesia, the general government, and the protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. High-capacity tracks ran directly to the site. Freight trains thundered past the perimeter 24 hours a day. Höss analyzed the landscape. He saw a massive industrial and transport hub for the SS macroeconomy. The site offered vast land for expansion and isolation for secrecy. Yet it remained close enough to major factories to exploit captive labor. Höss studied the blueprints of the former Polish barracks. He planned their conversion. Brick by brick, prisoners transformed military dormitories into cells. On May 1, 1940, the first iteration of the camp opened. Auschwitz I had a capacity for 10,000 inmates. Most were Polish political prisoners and local Jews. In March 1941, Heinrich Himmler arrived for an inspection. He observed the progress. He approved of the management. Efficiency dictated the next move. Himmler issued a verbal decree. The camp must expand to hold 30,000 prisoners. He anticipated a massive influx of captives from the upcoming invasion of the Soviet Union. During this visit, the objective shifted. Logistics met ideology. Himmler designated Auschwitz as the primary center for the final solution. The systematic extermination of European Jews now had a physical coordinates. The order was confirmed. The spring of 1941 brought a directive from Himmler that demanded a radical expansion of lethal capacity. Rudolf Höss did not hesitate. He approached the task with the same bureaucratic precision that defined his rise through the SS apparatus. 2,000 people died in a single cycle. This was the target capacity for the new chambers. To reach it, Höss first retreated to the claustrophobic confines of the main camp. In September 1941, the search for an industrial solution led to the basement of Block 11. Höss ordered the windows sealed with earth. Soldiers carried heavy tin cans into the yard. Inside were blue-stained crystals of a common pesticide. The air in the basement grew thick with the sharp, bitter almond scent of prussic acid. Höss watched the stopwatch. 600 Soviet prisoners of war served as the test subjects. The gas worked faster than bullets. It left no blood on the floor. Execution by firing squad had created a logistical crisis for the SS. Soldiers suffered from chronic PTSD and alcoholism after mass shootings on the Eastern Front. Chemical optimization solved the psychological burden of the executioners. In October 1941, construction shifted to the village of Brzezinka, known as Birkenau. Höss drafted the blueprints for a factory. He designed 4 massive installations where killing and disposal occupied the same footprint. Steel doors with rubber gaskets ensured a vacuum seal. The final engineering phase transformed the camp into a closed-loop system of slaughter. Each of the 4 new complexes at Birkenau achieved a sustained throughput of 2,000. The introduction of Zyklon B transformed Birkenau into a seamless conveyor of death. Logistics replaced murder. By 1944, the infrastructure reached its peak. The process began at the ramp. A locomotive hissed, bringing the transport directly inside the camp perimeter. SS doctors stood ready. One man, often Joseph Mengele or his colleagues, watched the line. A flick of the wrist, left, right. The selection took seconds. Those fit for labor moved toward the barracks. The others, the elderly, children, and the sick, marched toward the white farmhouses. They reached the undressing rooms. The air felt cold. SS guards maintained a calm, professional tone to prevent any disruption of the schedule. "Remember your hook number," the guards commanded. "You will need it to find your clothes after the shower." This single detail ensured order. The victims folded their coats. They tied their shoes together. They believed in a future that had already been erased. The victims entered the chambers. Heavy steel doors groaned on their hinges. The metallic clang of the lever signaled the airtight seal. Above, an SS technician opened a small hatch. He poured the blue-gray crystals of Zyklon B through the ceiling vents. Inside, the gas reacted with the air. Asphyxiation took approximately 20 minutes. It was not a silent end. It was a frantic, desperate struggle in the dark. The Sonderkommando moved in next. These units of prisoners handled the aftermath. They worked with mechanical speed. One team sheared hair, Another used pliers to extract gold teeth from the corpses. This secondary harvest turned the dead into a source of revenue for the SS treasury. During the mass deportation of Hungarian Jews in 1944, the system buckled. The 4 crematoria could not keep pace with the influx of 400,000 people. The ovens glowed white-hot and began to crumble. To maintain the tempo, Höss ordered the digging of massive pits behind Crematorium 5. Open-air fires burned day and night. The capacity of the specialized ovens had been exceeded, forcing the staff to incinerate thousands in open trenches. By late autumn of 1943, the administrative apparatus of the Reich recorded a friction in the gears of its most efficient commandant. An internal SS investigation uncovered a breach of discipline. Rudolf Höss had entered a relationship with a political prisoner. For the high command, this was not a moral failure, but a bureaucratic deviation. Corruption and administrative violations within the concentration camp system became the primary focus of a special SS commission in 1943. Control had to be absolute. In November 1943, Berlin removed Höss from his post at Auschwitz. He was transferred to the Inspectorate of Concentration Camps. There, he traded the smell of the crematoria for the silence of a desk. He began to write. His memoirs reveal a mind consumed by logistical precision. The handwriting in his autobiography is steady. Every line is a cold calculation of mass murder. He describes the procedure as a sequence of optimized steps. First, the separation of men from women. Then, the calm march toward the gas chambers designed to look like shower rooms. He noted the silence of the victims. He recorded the efficiency of the deception. Even in his private notes, Höss remained a functionary. He viewed the murder of 430,000 people not as a crime, but as a solved logistical problem. To him, the human element was merely a variable in an equation of extermination. In November 1943, the SS High Command officially signed the order for his removal from the camp. The gallows stood next to the brick chimney of the first crematorium. April 1947. The air was cold. Rudolf Höss walked toward the noose with a steady military step. He did not struggle. He did not scream. The Nuremberg trials and subsequent tribunals established a new precedent in international law. For the first time, the world prosecuted systemic genocide as a state-managed industry. Höss was the primary exhibit. He was the architect who transformed mass murder into a logistics problem. He spent his final months in a Polish prison cell. There, he maintained his habit of meticulous documentation. He wrote his autobiography with a steady hand. He calculated the dead. 1 million victims. How does a man measure his life in corpses? Höss provided the answer in ink. He viewed his tenure not as a crime, but as a completed assignment. His family lived in a villa mere meters from the gas chambers. In the evenings, he helped his children with their schoolwork. He kissed them goodnight. Then, he stepped back into the machinery of the Shoah. The wooden trapdoor waited. The executioner prepared the rope. The bureaucrat of death had reached the final line of his ledger. The hatch opened. British intelligence captured a nondescript farmhand in northern Germany in March 1946. But 2 years earlier, the Reich summoned this same man to execute the largest demographic purge in human history. Why divert critical resources to destroy an integrated society while the military fronts collapsed? By early 1944, defeat was certain. Logic demanded every soldier and every train remain at the front. Berlin chose a different path. On March 19, 1944, the Wehrmacht crossed the Hungarian border. Operation Marguerite was not a conquest of an enemy, but the occupation of an ally. The political mechanics were swift. German troops entered Budapest. The Nazis dissolved the existing government and installed Dom Stoye, a reliable collaborator. The administrative machinery of the Holocaust, led by Adolf Eichmann's Sonderkommando, moved into the capital immediately. 800,000 people. This population represented 5% of Hungary's total census. They were doctors, engineers, and shopkeepers. Overnight, the state reclassified them as targets. the streets of Budapest filled with yellow stars. Officials confiscated bank accounts and seized apartments. Families moved into overcrowded, precarious ghettos. The Nazi leadership gave this specific campaign a unique name: Aktion Höss. It was an unusual, direct tribute to Rudolf Höss. His cold efficiency was now the state's highest priority. Eichmann arrived to manage the logistics of isolation. 12,000 victims every 24 hours. This was the target. On May 8, 1944, Rudolf Höss returned to Auschwitz with a mandate signed by Himmler. He did not need a formal title. He arrived as a plenipotentiary of death, tasked with a single objective: the liquidation of the Hungarian Jews. The camp became a military-industrial complex. To feed the furnace, the Reich prioritized ideology over the front lines. 140 trains, thousands of essential freight wagons were diverted from the Wehrmacht's supply routes. Between May and July, 430,000 people moved toward the wire. Logistics dictated the pace. Höss ordered a radical anatomical shift of the camp's geography. A new railway platform, the Birkenau ramp, cut through the heart of the complex. The tracks no longer stopped at the gate. They extended directly to the gas chambers. Engineers tightened the transit time. Screeching brakes of military echelons echoed across the yard. The doors opened. The distance from the wagons to the chemical showers was now a matter of meters. It was a production line of biomass. The machine reached its absolute limit. In the most intense periods, the infrastructure processed 12,000 lives a day. 140 trains delivered 430,000 people to the edge of the pits. The infrastructure of Birkenau collapsed under the weight of 12,000 arrivals per day. Engineering limits vanished. Logistics transformed into raw biology. SS doctors like Joseph Mengele conducted selections with clinical indifference. A flick of a wrist, a motion of a finger. These gestures dictated the immediate fate of the Hungarian transports. Between 10 and 30% of arrivals survived the initial screening for slave labor. The majority, children, the elderly, and women with infants, moved directly toward the gas chambers. They died without a serial number. They disappeared without a record. The four main crematoria possessed a design capacity of 4,400 corpses every 24 hours. During the Hungarian operation, the state demanded double. The brick and steel of the ovens failed. Engineering gave way to primitive excavations. Large pits appeared in the forest clearing near the gas chambers. Guards forced Sonderkommandos, special units of Jewish prisoners, to stack the bodies in open-air pyres. To accelerate the destruction of biomass, the administration introduced methanol. Temperature control required extreme measures. The pits collected runoff of human fat, which was recycled to feed the flames. The Sonderkommandos handled the industrial output of the genocide. They lived in total isolation from other prisoners. These men knew the state protocols required their own liquidation every few months to ensure absolute secrecy. A thick column of dark soot rose into the sky, visible for miles across the Polish countryside. The future Nobel laureate Elie Wiesel arrived in May 1944 and looked up. He saw the smoke first. Then he felt the air. The smell of burnt flesh impregnated every corner of the camp. It clung to the lungs. It soaked into the soil. Wiesel watched the disposal of small children in open fire pits. The scene was surreal. Death had become a logistical routine. How did the system adapt to this volume? Rudolf Verba had escaped shortly before the operation. He confirmed the reorganization. The entire Auschwitz complex shifted its engineering focus. Its sole purpose was the liquidation of Hungarian Jews. Efficiency replaced the last remains of human hesitation. Historian Raoul Hilberg categorized this period as the mechanical peak of the Holocaust. Under the direct supervision of Rudolf Höss, the camp functioned as a high-output factory. It combined industrial precision with raw ideological cruelty. The economic cost was staggering. By the spring of 1944, the Wehrmacht was retreating on all fronts. The Eastern Front required every liter of fuel and every train car available. Yet the Reich prioritized the gas chambers. The resources consumed by the camp, the coal, the methanol, the transport, could have supplied an entire army group against the Soviets. Military victory became secondary. Ideology outweighed survival. 7,600 people died every single day. Then, the gears of the machine ground to a halt. The operation ended abruptly in early July 1944. The July 1944 halt of the killing machine did not stem from mercy. It was triggered by the Verba-Wetzler report. 2 escapees from Auschwitz provided the first detailed evidence of the gas chambers. The document reached the International Diplomatic Corps, the Vatican, and Swedish diplomats. Pressure mounted on Hungarian regent Miklos Horthy. In July 1944, Horthy ordered the suspension of all deportations. The administrative gears paused for political reasons. 200,000 Jews remained in Budapest. Many would later perish under the fascist Arrow Cross regime, but the systematic rail transports to the east stopped. The scale of the preceding 56 days defied military logic. The SS had murdered a population equal to the entire city of Amsterdam. 7,600 people died every 24 hours. Rudolf Höss left Auschwitz in August 1944. The state promoted him. He took a senior bureaucratic post in the central administration of concentration camps in Oranienburg, near Berlin. From his new desk, Höss managed the final logistics of the camp system. This included the death marches. Tens of thousands more died in the snow during the final months of the conflict. In December 1944, Höss returned to Auschwitz for the last time. The Red Army was approaching from the east. His mission was no longer expansion, but erasure. He supervised the evacuation of the camp and the destruction of the archives. Höss prioritized the shredder over the prisoners. The state apparatus focused on the industrial elimination of its own history. Thousands were forced to march west in sub-zero temperatures. Behind them, the administration burned the evidence. The documents turned to ash. 4 months after the Auschwitz archives turned to ash, the central authority in Berlin ceased to exist. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. The state was a corpse. The administrative machinery of the Holocaust shifted from mass murder to individual survival. What is the protocol for the architect of a state-led genocide when the state itself vanishes? The collapse followed a precise bureaucratic script. In March 1945, Heinrich Himmler issued the final directive to his executioners. They were to dissolve. Himmler's instructions relied on pre-arranged evacuation networks, banking on the hope that the Allies would soon pivot to war against the Soviet Union. Rudolf Höss stood among the ruins of his career. He was one of the most wanted men on the planet. The High Command began the distribution. Officers handled fresh, crisp blanks of naval identity papers. The ink was barely dry. Höss received his set. The document identified him as Friedrich Lang. His new rank? A simple sailor in the Kriegsmarine. The instructions were surgical. Avoid the cities. Sever all contact with family. Look for work in the most isolated rural sectors. Höss, the man who managed the logistics of millions, was now ordered to disappear into a hayloft. The Nazi leadership envisioned these escapes not as a retreat, but as a preservation of cadres for a future Fourth Reich. Höss headed north toward the Flensburg area. He carried the identity of a non-existent sailor in a navy that no longer had a fleet. He was now a ghost with a paycheck. By May, the man who supervised the greatest death machine in history was officially a farmhand. The architect of history's most efficient death machine now held a shovel. The man who managed the logistics of millions became a silent laborer in the mud. He was no longer a commandant, he was a ghost. With the false papers of a Kriegsmarine sailor in his pocket, Rudolf Höss moved north. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. Central authority vanished. Höss crossed into the agrarian heart of Schleswig-Holstein. This region was a black hole for bureaucracy. It was isolated, rural, and swamped with the human wreckage of the Reich. Millions of refugees and demobilized soldiers choked the roads. Amidst this demographic chaos, a mass murderer was just another face in the crowd. The cold air of the barn at the farm in Gottrupel near Flensburg offered a Spartan sanctuary. Höss adopted a new identity. His name was Franz Lang. He worked the soil and lived in silence. He was middle-aged and unremarkable, a quiet farmhand who followed orders and kept his head down. Himmler's instructions were clear: disappear into the civilian population and wait for the inevitable conflict between the Western powers and the Soviets. The werewolf strategy failed to spark a revolt, but it succeeded as a cloaking device. For almost a year, the man who built Auschwitz lived as a peasant just a few kilometers from the Danish border. Höss managed to evade capture for 308 days. In November 1945, the Nuremberg International Military Court began its proceedings. This legal machine did more than issue indictments. It launched a systematic hunt. Testimonies from the dock pulled the veil back from the death camps. One name surfaced repeatedly: Rudolf Höss. The architect of the abyss was no longer a ghost. He was a target. British intelligence took the lead. Lieutenant Colonel Gerald Draper headed the War Crimes Investigation Unit. His team built a network of informants. They tracked shadows across the ruins of Europe. The breakthrough came in St. Michael im Lungau. Hedwig Höss and her children were living there in the American occupation zone. Investigators intercepted her mail. They monitored every movement. They knew she held the key to the husband's disguise. In March 1946, British officers detained Hedwig. Captain William Cross led the interrogation. The room stayed silent for hours. Hedwig refused to speak. She held her husband's secret behind a wall of loyalty. Interrogators changed tactics. They turned to psychological pressure. They focused on her eldest son, Klaus. The threat was explicit. If she stayed silent, the British would hand Klaus over to the Soviet army. In 1946, everyone knew what that meant. Transfers to the Soviet zone bypassed legal procedures. Smersh did not use courtrooms. Hedwig looked at her son. The wall broke. On March 11, 1946, Hedwig Höss surrendered the coordinates of the farm near Flensburg. The coordinates provided by British intelligence on March 11th led Captain William Cross and his unit directly to the Gottrupel farm. Hans Alexander led the search. He was a German Jew. In 1936, he fled Berlin to escape the Nazi apparatus. A decade later, he returned in a British uniform. He was now a hunter of the very men who had erased his world. The squad reached the farm near Flensburg in the pre-dawn darkness. The air was biting and still. Alexander's team from the 92nd Security Field Regiment moved in silence. They surrounded the barn. Rudolf Höss was inside. The architect of the final solution slept in a cramped cellar used by seasonal laborers. The soldiers breached the door. Höss sat up in bed, shivering in his underwear. He was no longer a commandant. He was a farmhand. He handed over his papers. The name on the document read Franz Lang. For a moment, the deception held. But Alexander had the testimony of Hedwig Höss. He knew the man in the cellar was not a simple laborer. The soldiers in the room were veterans of the front. Some had seen the piles of corpses at the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. They did not wait for a court order. The primary interrogation began with immediate physical violence. The legend of Franz Lang withstood the initial pressure from the veterans of Bergen-Belsen. These men had seen the mountains of corpses and the hollow eyes of the survivors. They knew the face of the enemy, but the man before them remained silent. The investigative focus shifted to a medical bandage on the prisoner's hand. Beneath the gauze, there was no wound. A golden wedding ring remained on his finger, hidden from view. A soldier pulled the ring from the laborer's grime-covered hand. The metal caught the light. On the inner surface, a clear engraving appeared, names and a wedding date. The inscription destroyed the cover story. Faced with his own identity, the prisoner stopped pretending. He was Rudolf Höss, former commandant of Auschwitz. The capture transitioned into an interrogation of extreme intensity. British intelligence and Hans Alexander's team utilized specific protocols to break his psychological defenses. Sleep deprivation lasted for 3 consecutive days. The method was calculated. Depriving a subject of sleep for 72 hours serves as a standard military tool to erase the boundary between justice and retribution. Soldiers struck the prisoner repeatedly. The air in the room remained thick with the tension of immediate post-war vengeance. These actions created a legal dilemma. In the shadow of the recently discovered gas chambers, the line between an interrogation and torture blurred. The veterans did not see a defendant. They saw the architect of a slaughterhouse. Under the weight of physical exhaustion and the collapse of his lie, the commandant finally began to provide details of the system. The administrator of the industrial death machine began to cooperate. The process of legal deconstruction began on April 5, 1946, with the signing of a single document. In the cells of Minden prison, the former commandant discarded his alias. Frankness replaced evasion. While others claimed ignorance, the administrator chose technical cooperation. The interrogation shifted to the mechanics of the machine. Why did the commandant voluntarily detail the extermination scheme? A bureaucratic reflex. He followed a lifelong habit of reporting to a higher authority. The document received its official designation, PS 3868. The scene was sterile. Typists finalized the English draft. Translators converted the text into German. The commandant placed his signature at the bottom. The ink dried on columns of industrial slaughter. The document, PS 3868, became the bedrock of the prosecution. It was not a confession of guilt, but a logistical report. The figures were staggering. 3 million victims. This number exceeded the population of most European capitals at the time. The commandant stated that 70 to 80% of all arrivals were killed immediately. The rest became fuel for the camp industries. Later, forensic analysis and demographic records would force a revision of the data. The final death toll was adjusted to 1.1 million. Ten days after signing the affidavit, on April 15, 1946, the documented statistics reached a global audience. The International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg became the final stage for the camp administrator. He did not sit in the dock with the primary defendants. He arrived as a witness. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, chief of the RSHA, called him to testify. The defense sought to shift blame or dilute responsibility. Instead, the testimony became a lethal strike against the entire SS hierarchy. The local efficiency of a commandant transformed into the foundational evidence of a state-run machine. His bureaucratic precision did not falter under oath. He described the gas chambers. He detailed the selection process. He explained the industrial processing of human remains. How did the architect of death view his work? He saw it as a task completed. He did not deny the atrocities. He presented himself as a cog in a vertical system of orders. The scale of the massacre met the cold reality of the courtroom. Prosecution lawyer Whitney Harris confronted the witness with the numbers from his own records. 2.5 million men, women, and children. The courtroom froze as the figure was read aloud. Harris asked if the witness had personally supervised these executions. Höss responded with a single syllable: yes. International law dictated a shift in jurisdiction. On July 30, 1946, the British handed the prisoner over to the Polish authorities. Justice returned to the site of the crime. The state moved him to Mokotów prison in Warsaw. How did the Polish prosecution build its case? They integrated the prisoner's private writings with the testimony of those who survived him. Behind bars, the administrator began to write. He filled pages with a detailed autobiography. He did not write under duress. The text revealed a chilling paradox. The author described himself as a meticulous bureaucrat, merely following orders. Yet the operational details he provided proved a total understanding of the industrial slaughter. He was not a cog. He was the architect. The state prepared the evidence. Prosecutors gathered Auschwitz records and matched them against survivor accounts. These witnesses identified the man in the dock as the commander who personally supervised the selections on the ramp. They remembered his coldness. The legal mechanism reached its final stage in the spring. On March 11, 1947, the Supreme National Tribunal of Poland opened the trial. The indictment focused on his membership in the SS and the organized murder of 2,800,000 people. The Supreme National Tribunal concluded its proceedings on April 2, 1947. In the dock, Rudolf Höss maintained the same clinical detachment that defined his tenure at Auschwitz. He did not scream. He did not plead. Instead, he argued over specific death tolls like an accountant correcting a ledger. The court reached a decision. It ordered the execution to take place at the precise site of his administration, the Auschwitz concentration camp. This was not a symbolic gesture, but a legal mandate. The tribunal found Höss guilty on all counts and sentenced him to death by hanging. The verdict remained a cold, procedural document. No moral adjectives, no emotional rhetoric, only the law. In the isolation of his cell, Höss produced a final handwritten statement. He sat alone with a pen and paper. He wrote of a late realization. "My conscience forces me to make the following statement," the text read. He acknowledged his role in the Third Reich's machinery of destruction. He admitted to the suffering of the Polish people. He accepted the finality of the court. He would pay with his life. Exactly 14 days after the Polish Supreme National Tribunal issued its verdict, the bureaucratic machinery of the state engaged. April 16, 1947, 8 o'clock in the morning, a single vehicle approached the main gate of the Auschwitz concentration camp. The engine note cut through the silence of the vacant site. Rudolf Höss exited the vehicle. He wore a dark coat. His hands were bound behind his back. The former commandant remained impassive. His face showed no trace of emotion as Polish guards led him toward the former administration building. This was his old workplace. Why did the state return him to the site of his crimes? The Polish government honored the request of survivors. They demanded the architect die where his system functioned. Inside the administration block, the routine turned clinical. Höss requested a final cup of coffee. He drank slowly. This brief, human gesture stood in stark contrast to the mass industrial slaughter he once supervised from the same rooms. The escort then initiated the final march. They moved toward Block 11. The route was a deliberate administrative choice. Block 11 had functioned as the camp's internal court and torture center. Thousands of political prisoners had faced their ends within those brick walls. Höss walked the same path as his victims. He approached the space of Block 11. The state machine reached its final destination at Crematorium 1. Polish authorities did not use the camp's existing mass gallows. They engineered a specific timber frame for a single execution. Who stood by to witness the act? A small perimeter of officials, journalists, and a few survivors. Among them was prosecutor Jan Zen, the man who had deconstructed the commandant's bureaucracy into a death sentence. The spatial geometry was precise and deliberate. The scaffold stood in the shadow of the Crematorium 1 chimney. Only a few meters separated the gallows from the house where the family lived. Behind those walls, 5 children had played while their father supervised the industrial slaughter on the other side. Höss exited Block 11 at 10 in the morning. He walked with a firm pace. No guards supported him. Father Vladislav Lone walked at his side. The man who had abandoned Catholicism years ago had returned to the confessional in his final days. Höss reached the platform. He examined the wooden structure. It was a high stage with a central trapdoor and a single rope. It was simple, functional. It was an exact replica of the devices he had once ordered for the execution of prisoners. Prosecutor Jan Zen stepped forward. He began the final reading. The document summarized the legal reality of the defendant. Membership in a criminal organization, the murder of millions, crimes against humanity. Höss listened in total silence. Jan Zen finished the reading of the Judicial Act. The reading of the Judicial Act concluded. The protocol of execution entered its final stage. Höss stood before the wooden structure. His hands remained bound. Guards assisted him as he ascended the steps. On the platform, a hooded executioner waited. At 10:08, the trapdoor snapped open. The drop lasted a fraction of a second. Höss remained suspended. Father Vladislav Lone began the prayer for the condemned. The execution was a clinical procedure. A group of witnesses watched in silence. Among them was Kazimierz Smolin. He was a former Auschwitz prisoner and the future director of the Memorial Museum. For Smolin, this was not a celebration. It was a cold administrative necessity. The state was removing a component of a broken machine. Did Höss express remorse? Witnesses reported a brief statement in German, "I accept my punishment." Some heard a final reference to the survival of Germany. These details remained unconfirmed. 13 minutes passed. The body hung motionless against the brick wall of Crematorium 1. At 10:21, the physician stepped forward. He checked for a pulse. He officially certified the death of Rudolf Höss. The physical existence of the administrator ended. 1 hour later, the body was removed from the gallows. The state then implemented the policy of erasure. Allied and Polish authorities sought to prevent the creation of a cult site. No grave was permitted. Höss underwent cremation. Officials then scattered the ashes at an undisclosed location. The physical trace of the commandant vanished. The execution team dismantled the gallows 3 hours after the drop. The physical erasure of the body in 1947 did not end the history of the administrator. The system's logic survived. It remained in the manuscripts he produced while awaiting the gallows. In 1951, the Polish state published these records under the title Commandant of Auschwitz. The book became a blueprint of the industrial Holocaust. It was not a confession of guilt. It was a technical report. The cover of the 1951 Polish edition signaled a shift from execution to documentation. Höss wrote with the precision of an engineer. He analyzed the mechanism of mass murder. He evaluated gas chambers as a technical solution. Did he feel remorse? No. He felt a professional obligation to improve the process. He described the transition to Zyklon B as an act of progress. In his memoirs, he labeled the gas chambers a more humane method. This term had a specific meaning in the SS hierarchy. It did not refer to the victims. It referred to the executioners. The state sought to protect the mental health of its staff. Shooting thousands of civilians caused psychological strain. Gas removed the direct contact. It turned murder into a bureaucratic procedure. Höss viewed the extermination as a logistical challenge. He focused on the delivery of chemicals. He monitored the capacity of the crematoria. He measured the time required for complete liquidation. The text lacks emotional reflection. It contains only the methodology of a subordinate. He prioritized the execution of instructions over the consideration of their nature. The mechanical death described in the memoirs of 1951 became the foundation for global reflection. Philosophers began to dissect the administrative logic of the gallows. What happens to the infrastructure of genocide after the courts? The national parliament transforms it into a state instrument of historical documentation. In 1947, the Polish parliament passed a law. The former extermination site became a museum. Primo Levi, a survivor and chemist, analyzed the men behind the wire in his work, If This Is a Man. He concluded that the real danger lay not in rare monsters, but in ordinary officials. These were men ready to obey without discussion. Hannah Arendt later codified this phenomenon during the trial of Adolf Eichmann. She called it the banality of evil. It was a cold, bureaucratic indifference to murder. The site shifted from a local crime scene to an international monument. In 1979, UNESCO granted Auschwitz-Birkenau the status of a World Heritage Site. The decision was not based on aesthetics. The goal was to preserve tangible evidence of a systemic crime. The camp lost its national borders and became an extraterritorial symbol of memory. The final institutional seal came from the global community. The United Nations selected the date of the camp's liberation. It became a permanent marker in the international calendar. This occurred in the year 2005. The global institutionalization of memory shifted the focus from abstract evil to the mechanics of the individual. In 1992, historian Christopher Browning published Ordinary Men. The academic paradigm changed. The focus was no longer on congenital monsters, but on the systemic pressure that transforms a neighbor into a mass murderer. The bureaucracy did not require demons, it required functional administrators. The consequences of this system outlived its creator by decades. The legacy of the administrator haunted his own bloodline across continents. His daughter, Brigitte Höss, escaped to the United States. She lived in total anonymity for over 50 years. Her past remained a secret until a journalist discovered her in 2013. She was an old woman in Northern Virginia who had spent a lifetime hiding a name that the world could never forget. The weight of the name fell differently on his son, Hans Jürgen. For years, he maintained a state of psychological denial regarding his father's role in the final solution. The transition from silence to acknowledgement took decades of internal conflict. He eventually chose a path of public confrontation with his family's history. Hans-Jürgen Höss decided to dedicate his remaining years to lecturing on the specific dangers of political extremism. The institutional confrontation with this legacy reached its structural climax in 2024. The family villa of Rudolf Höss underwent a total transformation. It stands only a few meters from the gas chambers. Modern glass and steel now occupy the rooms where children once played. This is the Auschwitz Institute, known as ARCER. The Center for Research on Hate and Extremism now operates within these specific walls. It serves as a laboratory for studying radicalization at the very epicenter of the family's daily life. The architecture of the house remains, but the purpose has shifted. Researchers analyze the mechanics of dehumanization in the same space where a commandant once signed death ledgers. The site illustrates a critical geopolitical reality. Advanced bureaucracy is no shield against atrocity. High levels of education do not prevent the industrialization of murder. Elie Wiesel, a Nobel Peace Prize laureate and survivor, provided the definitive warning. He stated that forgetting the dead is equivalent to killing them a second time. The conversion of the villa into a pedagogical tool prevents this secondary execution. It forces a confrontation with the fact that Höss was not a mindless monster, but a conventional administrator. He operated within a state system that normalized violence through step-by-step logic. The industrial genocide at Auschwitz was the result of human decisions. Each bureaucratic choice led to the next. This lesson remains the most significant outcome of the 20th century. The threat of such systems persists as long as the mechanisms of dehumanization are ignored. The potential for these conditions to resurface remains an active global risk.